elected prosecutor in the city of St. Louis. And I think that is why Chris tapped me to handle, to moderate this part of our discussion today. Because in this conference, we're going to be talking about a lot of things, and we're going to showcase a variety of different perspectives, and some of them are going to be quite differing, and we've designed it that way. That was Sim's vision for this conference. However, this topic, violent crime, is one I think that we can all pretty well agree on the fact that the role of a modern prosecutor, an old-fashioned prosecutor, any kind of prosecutor you can think of, is to push back on violent crime in their community. So the question is, what does that look like? What does it look like when a modern prosecutor is fighting against violent crime in their community? The city of St. Louis, unfortunately, is one of the most violent cities in America. It was when I was the circuit attorney, and my successor, Kim Gardner, is with us today, and I'm sure if you ask her at the reception, she would say that not much has changed in that regard. So this is a challenge that many of you are facing. So what we have here today, and how we're going to proceed with our portion of this conference, is first we're going to hear from Commissioner Mike Green. And again, we've been told no bios, so I'll let him tell you about his job and what he does. He has some very interesting ideas about how prosecutors can be more proactive in fighting violence in their communities. And he has worked in that area and seen some great results. Then we're going to hear from Barbara Lawal, who is the elected prosecutor in Tucson, Arizona. And she's going to talk about her recent initiative with domestic violence victims and trying to prevent domestic violence homicides that we all know are something that cuts across all socioeconomic margins, everything. Anybody can be considered a possible victim of a domestic violence homicide. So when you can reduce those, you've really made an impact. And then after that, we'll hear from my former colleague, Jean Peters Baker, who is from Jackson County, Missouri, which is, I call it the west side. It's Kansas City, Missouri, as opposed to St. Louis on the east side of the state. And Jean's going to talk about some of the things that she is doing to fight against homicides in her jurisdiction that is kind of new and interesting and having some good success. Then we're going to hear one more time from Mike, and he's going to tell us about another initiative that he's working on with respect to non-fatal shooting. And then after that, believe it or not, we're going to have 20 minutes left over for questions from the audience. So while you're listening to these speakers, think about what questions you have for them. We have a great variety of expertise up here and a lot of good ideas, so I hope that you'll take advantage and have some questions. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Commissioner Green.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I have to compete with being the first one after lunch and the Senate hearings. I'll do the best I can here. But just by way of a very quick introduction, I am not a prosecutor now, but I did spend 25 years as a prosecutor in Rochester, New York. I had the pleasure of working with Denise O'Donnell when she was the U.S. Attorney for our district. Spent the last 8 years as the elected district attorney in the office, and have been in the job I'm in now for about 6.5 years. And for about 22 years of the time I spent in the district attorney's office, I tried homicide cases. I tried about 50 homicide cases to verdict, tried over 100 felony trials altogether, I think 112 to be exact, but who's counting? And so certainly that colors my perspective. And I think as all of us have realized at some point along the way, as much as we need to be good at taking cases, whether they're homicide cases or other violent crime cases, and being able to successfully prosecute those cases and get the outcomes that we need to get, that alone is not going to end our violence problem. And I remember very specifically one time after a murder case I prosecuted, and it was one teenage boy who killed another teenage boy, and he was convicted of murder in the second degree and was sentenced to 25 years to life. And we walk out of the courtroom, and the normal group of reporters is out there. And one of the reporters asked me, "Are you happy?" And I thought, what a strange question to ask. What is there to be happy about? I thought the outcome was the right outcome. I thought it was justice under the circumstance. But one young man was still dead, and nothing was going to change that. And his family didn't feel a whole heck of a lot better about the whole thing. The other young man was going away to prison for 25 to life. The whole concept of happy, it just seemed to be such an absurd question at the time. If you think about that in the context of what is the prosecutor's role with regard to violent crime, it has to be more than just going to court, prosecuting cases, and getting convictions. So in my role with the Division of Criminal Justice Services, I lead that agency, and basically what we do at that agency is we try and provide resources and information to the criminal justice system to both help support the criminal justice system and improve the system, and to make our state safer. And I always have to brag just a little bit when I do these presentations. So this is from the most recent FBI data. I think it was just released in the last couple of weeks. For 2017, New York is the 6th safest state overall in terms of index crime. We are 4th in property crime. When I came to DCJS 6.5 years ago, I think we were actually 1st or 2nd. We're 24th in violent crime. Now that 24th tells me two things when I look at it. One, obviously, if I'm looking at the data from New York saying, where are our challenges and where do we need to continue to improve, that's one place we need to do it. But secondly, when I came to DCJS, we were 33rd. So we've moved from 33rd to 24th over the course of the last 6 years. So certainly, I think some positive news there to build on in terms of the direction we're going. Again, the index crime rate, when you look at all of the large states, a population of 10 million or more, New York has the lowest index crime rate of any. When you look at the imprisonment rate, New York also has the lowest imprisonment rate of any of those large states. So I think there's a lot of positive news there. In spite of that positive news, though, we clearly have challenges. Now, I'll just throw out one other piece of positive news. Cy alluded earlier today to the homicides in New York City and how they had declined significantly. That's true for the entire state. In 2017, the entire state of New York, with a population of 19.2 million people, had 547 homicides. There's cities much smaller than the state of New York that had more homicides in our entire state. So again, some very positive news. But when we look at the urban centers across our state, whether it's Buffalo or Rochester or Syracuse or Albany or New York City or any of our other urban centers, the fact of the matter remains that no matter how well we are doing, there's still too much violence in those urban centers, and specifically gun violence and shootings and killings. So one of the things I'm going to talk about is our gun-involved violence elimination program. And that's specifically geared to help support jurisdictions across the state in reducing shootings and homicides. We started this almost 5 years ago. And we built on something that Denise O'Donnell started and Chauncey Parker continued at DCJS called Impact, that involved bringing prosecutors and police departments and probation departments, sheriff's offices, and other partners together to fight crime. The idea was to take that same structure and figure out how we could most effectively support efforts among those partnerships to fight shootings and homicides. When we looked at the state, and we took New York City out of the picture for a number of different reasons that I won't get into now, but we looked at the rest of the state, 57 other counties in the state. Of those 57 counties, about 85% of the violent crime and the shootings came out of 17 of those 57 counties. So just looking at the data, it made sense to focus on those 17 counties. And we had a funding stream, and I'm not going to read, you have the PowerPoint presentation, so what I say may or may not track what's in there. But we had a funding stream of about $13.5 million to give out to those jurisdictions. And the idea was, how could we most effectively use that funding stream to help jurisdictions fight shootings and homicides and bring those numbers down? So we did a number of things. One, we said, we want to focus on evidence-based work. We only want to support efforts that are based on things that have been proven to be effective in the past. So we surveyed what was out there in terms of efforts that had been studied, had been used, and we ended up settling on 4 different strategies, for lack of a better word, that we thought had some pretty solid evidence behind them showing that they could be effective. And that was hotspot policing, focused deterrence, crime prevention through environmental design, and street outreach work. And what we ended up saying to all the 17 jurisdictions is, if you want to put together a plan in your jurisdiction using the problem-oriented policing framework and incorporating procedural justice aspects, a plan that incorporates one or more of those strategies. So a jurisdiction could say we want to do focused deterrence. They could say we want to try and do all 4. But put together a plan and we will support you and we'll give out awards based on both the data. So how many shootings do you have? What's your volume of shootings? If you have the most shootings in the state, that would dictate that you get a significant award. But also based on the quality of the plan, because we want to support work that's likely to have an impact. And we said, look, in the first year, most of the decision will be driven by the shooting data. By year 5, we're really going to take into account what type of work people are doing. And if after 5 years you haven't moved toward doing evidence-based work, that's going to impact on our funding decisions. And we're at that 5-year mark now, and we're seeing people do some really solid work in all of these areas. In addition to both having the $13 million to give out to the jurisdictions and identifying the strategies, we realized that part of the value we could bring to this was to help provide education and support for our partners. Every one of those 17 jurisdictions probably didn't have the ability to go out and hire top-notch technical assistants. But we as a state could hire and provide technical assistance and training in different formats for, across all 17 jurisdictions. So for example, with focused deterrence, we work with the National Network for Safe Communities and David Kennedy out of John Jay. Hotspot policing, we worked with Justice and Security Strategies and Craig Yoshida, and I believe Craig is going to be speaking here tomorrow. Oh, he couldn't make it. All right, he was scheduled to speak. But again, and you can look down the list and see the other folks we've worked with. But these are nationally respected, top level, in my opinion, people, and we brought them in different formats. So for example, we brought people from all 17 counties together and had presentations to 300 people to raise awareness of what these strategies were. We did smaller, for example, Ceasefire University across the state, where we'd bring 3 or 4 jurisdictions together, and David Kennedy or Craig Yoshida or others would come and put on a seminar for 3 or 4 jurisdictions. And then we do jurisdiction-specific technical assistance. I'll be talking in a little bit about Newburgh and how, for example, David Kennedy and the National Network are working one-on-one on the ground with Newburgh to help them with their focused deterrence effort. So it's not only identifying strategies, shaping the funding stream, but providing that technical assistance and support as people did the work. Now, it's always hard for me to say, how are these things working based on the data? Because if jurisdictions weren't doing this work, what would be happening? Would numbers be going up, wouldn't they? But there are certainly some encouraging signs. And if you look at shooting incidents, and I personally like to look at shooting incidents rather than homicides, just because I think the homicide numbers can fluctuate based on so many other factors. And I think the shooting numbers give you a better sense of the activity that you're trying to measure. But if you look at the 5-year average, 830 shooting incidents across the jurisdictions. For 2017, about a 7.5% decrease, or 767. And you say, oh, well, 7.5%, not a big deal, but that's a lot of people that didn't get shot, that would have been shot otherwise. And each one of those people and their families, that was significant. If you look January through August, to include the 2018 numbers, you see that 2018, at least so far, is trending very positively, both against the 5-year average and against 2017, which was below the 5-year average as well. So, again, I don't think this proves definitively, but it's certainly a positive indication in terms of the way things are moving for shootings. I just want to mention a couple other things that support this. So, we talk about street outreach as one of the strategies. In addition to GIVE, we support a network of 11 street outreach programs across the state under the heading of SNUG. One of the things, originally our program was modeled after the Cure Violence program, but I felt, and we felt strongly, that our street outreach work should be working hand in hand with GIVE and the work that prosecutors and police were doing. The goal is the same: reduce shootings and homicides. Maybe different ways of getting there. With the street outreach programs, it's important that on the street outreach workers keep separation from law enforcement, not be seen as part of law enforcement, but I felt that that separation didn't need to exist behind the scenes. And in fact, to be effective, they ought to be working together. If the police are trying to fight a spike in violence in a particular area, they ought to be able to reach out to their street outreach program and say, hey, could you help us? We have a problem here. And if there are particular disputes that are getting hot that may result in shootings or retaliation, they ought to be working together to make sure that each side is doing everything they can in coordination to reduce shootings and homicides. So what we ended up doing is hiring our own statewide coordinator, who's a former commander of the Rochester Police Department, and he's just done a fantastic job of, among other things, building those bridges between the street outreach programs and the police departments. We also hired a statewide training coordinator who came up through one of the SNUG programs. We've developed our own training program. So now we have our own program where we train every one of our outreach workers, violence interrupters, supervisors, and it's our own model that we train on. So every one of the people working in our program has gone through our training, gotten our certification. One other thing I wanted to mention, and that is the crime analysis centers. We support a network of crime analysis centers across the state. Denise really started this. She was instrumental in setting up the first 4 centers in Rochester, Buffalo, Syracuse, and Albany. We've now grown that to a network of 9 centers. Why are they important in this context? Because if you're going to use evidence-based strategies that are proactive, they all involve using data to be targeted. It's no longer good enough to say we throw a wide net out there and go after everything that moves in our jurisdiction. We've got to be targeted, we've got to be focused, we've got to know who the people are that are creating the problem, we've got to know what the places are that are creating problems in our jurisdiction. It's the crime analysis centers that really help drive that. So it's about a $7 million a year investment from the state to support those centers. They're partnerships, so every one of the localities that has a center also invests. Basically, those centers do 3 major things. We have about 300 law enforcement agencies connected through the crime analysis centers. So an analyst in any one of those centers, 24/7, can sit down at their terminal and type in Mike Green, or type in my license plate number, or my address, and find out if I am in the records management system of any of those 300 other law enforcement agencies anywhere in the state. And that could be from Suffolk County out on the tip of Long Island, to Buffalo on the western end of the state, up to Messina in the North Country, and anywhere in between. And it's just seamless, it's instantaneous, automatic, and we provide all the support to tie those systems together. The second thing we do is we take all of the state information, try and make it seamlessly accessible to the jurisdictions. So whether it's Department of Motor Vehicles information, whether it's Department of Corrections information, our analysts can now sit in those centers and, again, 24/7, pull up parole GPS information, visitors records from the Department of Corrections, which I remember as a prosecutor having to subpoena that information and wait weeks to get it. And now you call the analyst, and within minutes they've got the visitor logs for you, they've got the GPS information. So any state data that's out there, we make it seamlessly available to the extent we can through the centers. And then finally, we leverage our buying power to provide tools, things like social media mining tools, facial recognition tools, and others that really can be key in terms of helping prosecutors and law enforcement fight violent crime. Now, last thing, the non-fatal shooting we're going to talk about later, I want to give you 2 quick examples of good work being done under GIVE, particularly by prosecutors. First is Newburgh. Newburgh, if you go back, and I just Googled this to check, in 2010 there was an article in the New York Times, and the headline was Newburgh, Gangs and Violence Reign. And it quoted Senator Schumer's testifying before the Senate in the hearing, talking about how what was happening in Newburgh was shocking. 2015 article from the Newburgh paper talked about how Newburgh had again made the list of the top 10 most violent cities in America. So against this backdrop, with GIVE, we sat down with Newburgh and agreed that a focused deterrence or gun violence intervention effort would be something they wanted to embark on that would be useful. David Kennedy and the National Network partnered with us with Newburgh, and yeah, I think most of you know what it is, so I won't go into it, but the whole idea of not just blanketly arresting and prosecuting, but be very targeted. Doing call-ins, telling people what you're going to do ahead of time, doing enforcement actions. Again, very targeted enforcement actions. And the DA really took the lead here. The district attorney personally went to the call-ins and spoke at the call-ins and delivered the message. One of the things that's been incredible about Newburgh is they have gone through 4 police chiefs. They're on their 4th police chief since we started this. And the effort is still going strong, and it's because of the leadership in large part of the district attorney's office in driving this. Now, there's some slides on the data. Yeah, I think just to sum it up, Newburgh had 55 people shot in, I believe it was 2015. 55 people in 1 year. And it's a tiny, tiny city. Their 5-year average, I think, was 25. Last year they had 17. This year, to date, they've had 3 people shot so far this year. So from 55 people shot in 2015 to 3 so far this year. And yeah, I don't think the focused deterrence alone did it, but a couple things. Yeah, I was down in Newburgh and I was talking to some of the police officers, and they were telling me a story where they were out on patrol. One of the things they've instituted foot patrols, and there had been an enforcement action that had been done recently, and there were some women on a porch who started yelling to them, you're at it again, you rounded up another group of our kids. And the officers turned around, went back over, and engaged the women, and they actually have a card with the message on that summarizes what they're doing, that they're all trained in terms of talking points. And they told them, they said, look, we called them in. We also did custom notifications. We went out and met with them one-on-one. We warned them. We told them not to do this. We told them what would happen if they did it. And they continued to do it. And that's why there was this enforcement action. They got arrested. He said a couple of women said, oh, well, if you warned them and they did it anyhow, then good. They got what they had coming to them. And it just, it shows me a couple of different things. But, one, the idea of this targeted action. But 2, we talk about the community response. If we're targeted and we're fair in what we're doing and we communicate to communities what it is we're doing, we have a much better chance of getting community support, community buy-in. And once you get that, you don't tip from 55 to 3 without engaging the community in a positive way. And that was one of the ways they engaged the community. So I know I don't have much time left, so I just quickly want to mention Rochester. We have Sandra Dorley, who's the district attorney in Monroe County now, who's played a large part in this effort. But this is another piece of GIVE. They get funding under GIVE to support this. Monroe County started a gun court. This was separate and apart from anything we supported at DCJS. We started looking at the gun court and the shootings and the guns in Rochester, and we've been looking at the idea of swift, certain, and fair, Hawaii Hope, and a different probation model. And we met with Angela Hawken and Mark Kleiman in a different context for work that's being done through the Department of Corrections. We said, why couldn't we combine those? Traditionally been used for things like meth and low-level crimes and nonviolent crimes. We said, is there a role here for something like a very different probation model on young kids who get arrested with guns who are high risk? When I was DA, the policy was, if you get arrested with a gun, you went to prison. That was it. is there a better way to do it? Is there a more targeted, more focused way to do it? And so it started out being, okay, the police, the prosecutors, the probation department would meet and screen all the cases. And is this a case that, active shooter, active gang member, strict prosecution? Is this a case that we can take a chance on, swift, certain, and fair? And it turned out there was a third category. People were getting rejected from swift, certain, and fair because they didn't have enough risk factors. And so then they fell back into that bucket of, okay, you had a gun, the only offer is prison. And that didn't seem fair. If you weren't bad enough for swift, certain, and fair, then you had to go to prison. So the third category you see in the bottom is low-risk individuals who got this interim probation. But the idea with swift, certain, and fair was very high-risk kids who got caught with guns, who get put on probation, but it's a different probation model. And they have to agree at the start of it. There's a set schedule. You miss a probation appointment. You are in court in front of the judge the next day, and there's a set sanction. You may get a day in jail. You may get 2 days. You give a dirty urine. You may get 2 or 3 days. It's all set ahead of time. The defendants know, the defense attorney knows, the prosecutor knows. They've got a great judge who, the probation department says, this is wonderful. We call up and say, this guy just violated, I want him on the next day, and at 9:30 the next day, that case is on the docket. And the case, by the end of the day, the case has been dealt with, the sanction's been imposed. Flip side of it are the rewards. I'll show you the value of research. When a bunch of people were originally sitting around the table who were not the targets of this, saying what could we use for rewards, we came up with a whole bunch of ideas like sneakers, McDonald's, coupons. And then the researcher that was engaged with this said, why don't we get a bunch of people together who are, in essence, a group that are representative of our offenders, and ask them what would be incentives. And all the things that we thought of, they said would be insulting. So thank God we didn't go with our first reaction. They ended up coming up with things. To give you a few examples, one of the young men in the program who was doing the right thing, really worked to turn his life around, got himself a job, and went through the interview process, got hired. They told him, show up the next day. You need steel-toe work boots, but you get a full-time job. Of course, he doesn't have steel-toe work boots. He calls his probation officer, says, what do? I got a job. I'm supposed to start tomorrow morning. I don't have steel-toe work boots. Probation officer went out, bought him steel-toe work boots, delivered them to his house. And, so those are the type of incentives. Another example, telling us they had a closet full of things that we take for granted: deodorant, soap, other personal things, clean shirts, clean shorts. So that if you have to go to a job interview, you have to go somewhere else, and those types of things were meaningful to the people in the programs. So this idea that you take this incredibly high-risk group of people that in the past would have been, okay, you go to prison. I'm out of time, so I'll wrap this up. And you say, is there something better? So far, 17 people finished that program, 10 of them successfully. And by successfully, they have jobs, they're in school. 7 of them have failed out and gone to the Department of Corrections. In the past, all 17 of them would have gone to the Department of Corrections. So it's about a 60% success rate. You're saving money, you're getting better outcomes. In terms of community buy-in, what do you suppose of people in the community who now know that at-risk young kids like that are getting a chance? And in terms of using your resources, those high-risk cases now that everyone says no, they're going to trial, they get tried in 4 months. 4 months from the time of arraignment, because the system isn't clogged up with the other 2 categories of cases. That middle group of cases that need the intensive supervision from probation, probation's not bogged down with that bottom group of cases in terms of having to put the intensive work into all of the cases. So they're targeting, based on information, based on cooperative effort. So just 2 examples of how GIVE is working differently in different jurisdictions. I've got a bunch of data you'll see in your slides, but basically just showing that normally you think, wow, you're taking gun cases and putting them on probation, your shootings would go up. The exact opposite is happening. Through 17 and 18, the shootings are actually down. So with that, I will wrap it up. And I've got to put this back on a slide because there's one slide I'm going to need for later. It's that one. Thank you.
Next, we're going to hear from Barbara Lawal, who is the district attorney from Tucson.
Good afternoon. Not very long ago, one of my new rookie deputy county attorneys gets a telephone call to her supervisor. The supervisor gets a telephone call, and this young attorney says, "I need your help. And I need your help with a domestic violence victim that I've got. She doesn't want to testify. She's minimized the conduct of her abuser, who is her estranged husband. And she wants us to dismiss the case. I don't know what to say to her. I've tried everything." The supervisor goes over to justice court. This is a misdemeanor offense. It did not result in serious physical injury. It's what all of us would identify as a push and shove, hair grab, disorderly conduct. And he was arrested. There was no evidence and no proof but for the victim's testimony, because there were no injuries on her that were visible by any police officer who did the investigation. The supervisor went over, she tried to talk to the victim, to no avail. The victim stomped out of the courtroom. They tried to get a continuance to resume the case at a later time after they could spend more time with the victim. The judge refused and the case was dismissed. You've all had hundreds of those kinds of cases happen over the course of your career. 4 months later, this victim, her name was Becky, went to the door when she heard a pounding on her front door. She had her little toddler in her arms. She opens the door, it's her estranged husband, and he shoots her and kills her right there on the spot. During the course of the homicide prosecution, we discovered a number of things that we didn't know. We learned the following. We learned that the physical violence in that relationship had increased in frequency and severity over the past 12 months. We learned that the husband was intensely and violently jealous and extremely controlling. He controlled Becky's daily activities, cut her off from her family and her friends. He had struck and hit her while she was pregnant with the baby. He had threatened to kill her on several occasions, and she had reported this to her family and her friends. And he had also threatened to kill her, and the baby as well as her. He had guns in his possession, so he had the means to do this. He had previously choked her on another occasion. She did not report that. He had been unemployed for the previous 6 months. He had significant financial debt. He'd been drinking heavily and was, of course, facing the divorce that she was threatening him with. Had our lethality risk assessment been in place at the time of the original incident, the original misdemeanor offense, we would have been able to determine that Becky was at high risk for injury or death. And I'm sure that you've had cases very similar to this. So we all have too many stories like Becky's that end in serious physical injury or homicide. And we began to look for ways in order to reduce that. We wanted to approach our domestic violence cases more effectively and to be able to intervene. We needed to be able to consider violence and abuse outside of the charged incident. We needed to be able to identify domestic violence victims who were at elevated and high risk of lethality or serious physical injury. And we needed a better way to triage our cases and determine which of those victims in our cases need our serious attention and more resources. Let me tell you a little bit about Arizona and my county to understand what we did. Arizona is a state of 7 million people with 15 counties and 15 elected prosecutors. 50% of our population resides in Phoenix, in the Maricopa County area, and the rest of it, about a third, comes from my jurisdiction, which is 1 million. And I have 6 other towns that in addition to the city of Tucson, the unincorporated population in Pima County is about 500,000. So 500,000 comes from the cities and towns, and another 500,000 comes from the unincorporated area. My justice court, misdemeanor court, prosecutes all of the domestic violence misdemeanor offenses that come in through the unincorporated area and from a number of the smaller jurisdictions that contract with us to do those prosecutions. We have about 14,000 misdemeanor prosecutions every year. The city of Tucson has approximately the same number, and the other towns that have their town courts have about 5,000 to 6,000. So there are quite a number of domestic violence cases. Those are misdemeanor cases, and then we have hundreds of our felony cases as well. So in 2010, we put our heads together and we decided to pilot a lethality assessment program. But we wanted something that was tested, that was researched, that had been evaluated, that was evidence-based. And so we modeled our program after one that had been established for a number of years in Maryland. And it was the Maryland model. It was used in 3 separate jurisdictions in Maryland, and it had been developed and researched at Johns Hopkins. This lethality assessment protocol helped us more effectively predict and prevent intimate partner homicide and serious injury. So we had to do a number of things. We had to train our advocates to use it. We asked the police to help us because they're the ones that are called out at these initial scenes. They get the information. We needed them to be able to ask the questions on this protocol. And we needed them to be able to include that information on their police reports. We asked them. Most of the city of Tucson police helped to some degree. It wasn't mandated by their department, so not everybody did it. And then they were asked to ensure that our victim advocates were called out to the scene if somebody rated elevated or high risk. Now, let me tell you a little bit what we have in Pima County is very, very unique in our victim services program. I think we may have the only victim services program in the nation that has 125 trained volunteers that participate along with our victim advocates, and we actually go 24/7, 365 days a year. We're on call, we go to crime scenes. The police call us out to the crime scene to deal with the victims. So we have that as a resource that is extraordinarily different and very, very effective. Our advocates provide on-scene crisis advocacy to victims so the police can go about doing their evidence collection and doing the investigation. And we facilitate and connect the victims up with services, including things like doing safety planning with them, connecting them up with emergency housing, with counseling, childcare, legal services, and coordinating all that through the local domestic violence shelter. While we were utilizing this Maryland model, prosecutors in Maricopa County were using another resource. They were using information received from law enforcement on a survey called Course of Conduct, and they were using this to seek higher bonds on DV cases. Yavapai County, which is the western part of the county to the west of Phoenix, it's a much smaller county, was doing something similar but yet different. So we put together a task force. We put together a task force of DV prosecutors, victim advocates, law enforcement representatives, and what we created was a lethality assessment form because we needed something to be able to capture all of this information. In Arizona, it's called a Form 4, and it's the form that's used when police book a suspect into the jail. And it gives a brief summary of the charges and biographical information. Judges used Form 4 to determine what the conditions of release were. But we began to use the results of the lethality assessment from Maryland at court hearings to establish conditions of release and we would be able to determine whether or not we were going to ask for increased bail, specific no victim contact orders, prohibition on firearm possession, abstaining from alcohol, etc. Some judges considered the information on the lethality assessment protocol. Other judges simply ignored it or refused to consider it. So we did something else. We went to the legislature. Now, you all have worked with your legislatures, and you know that sometimes it's difficult to get them to enact a new bill. But it's oftentimes a lot easier when your bill protects public safety and costs nothing. So we went to the legislature and we successfully lobbied them, and we got a statute that mandated and required judges to consider the results of a lethality assessment in a DV presented case to the court. That was enacted in 2015, not too long ago. So after the judges were required now to consider this information on the Form 4, we realized that there was absolutely no uniformity throughout the state on the collection of this. There was no shared language among the various DV risk assessments being used across the state. They were being primarily used in the 3 counties, Pima, Maricopa, and Yavapai. Also, we had no validation. We didn't have any empirical follow-up on whether or not there was any success here. So these concerns were raised regarding the consistency of the assessments that were being submitted to the courts. Yavapai had been using a man by the name of Dr. Neil Websdale. He was the director of the National Domestic Violence Review Initiative out of Northern Arizona University. He was working with a woman by the name of Jill Messing, who was a professor and academic at the Arizona State University. And they had taken the Maryland model and created a domestic violence risk assessment that consisted of 2 tiers. Tier 1 questions, there were 7 of those, and Tier 2 questions, there were 9. And they also developed a very detailed police protocol. And all of this was based upon the nicely researched Johns Hopkins Maryland model. Then our Supreme Court asked us to come and give them a briefing, because now their judges were being mandated by legislation that required them to consider this information, and the Supreme Court said, we need to know what this is about. So we put together a briefing for the Arizona Supreme Court with prosecutors from the 3 jurisdictions that I mentioned, along with Dr. Websdale. We did this through our prosecuting attorneys council. We created a multidisciplinary working group. And after the briefing, this working group developed a uniform statewide DV risk assessment that was then adopted statewide by the Arizona Supreme Court. So that just happened in December of 2017 to be enacted and went into effect just this past April. They gave us those 4 months in order to be able to do statewide training. So the working group that met consisted of prosecutors, victim advocates, victim service providers, law enforcement, judges, academics. We included Dr. Websdale and Dr. Jill Messing. And this new form was agreed upon. It's evidence-based. It's been statistically validated. And it is an intimate partner risk assessment instrument. And it consists now of 7 Tier 1 questions and 11 Tier 2 questions. So I'm going to tell you what these questions are on Tier 1. I'm not going to take the time. Oh, I'm out of time.
You're okay, you're okay.
Okay, so here's what we want to know. Has the violence increased in frequency or severity over the past 6 months? Is he or she violently or constantly jealous of you? Do you believe he's capable of killing you? I'm not going to go through all of them. They are in your materials. This new instrument is called the Appraise. And it's called the Appraise because that stands for the Arizona Intimate Partner Risk Assessment System. We just call it our risk assessment. It will tell us whether somebody's at an elevated risk because they've said yes to 2 or 3 of the Tier 1 questions, or at high risk for future serious injury or death because they've answered 4 or more out of those 7. And now we have this standardized form. It's been used by every jurisdiction statewide. We are able to identify those individuals, and one of the things that has been so helpful in my county is that we have a protocol that requires the police, if they end up with an elevated or high-risk assessment, they are to call the domestic violence center, put the victim on the line with the center and let them talk to her. We're not forcing the victims into shelter or into treatment, but those experienced counselors have a way of explaining what it means to be in an elevated or high-risk situation where death or serious injury is imminent. They also are required to call our victim advocate out to the scene when somebody scores elevated or high. And so the police training has gone on statewide. It is continuing with all of the new officers. There's a 3-hour training program. We have a very unique training program that we've done in Pima County, and we have direct protocols that we have written. So although your jurisdiction may not have this, I encourage you to look at it, to look at my materials that I've included. There are very unique challenges regarding developing a lethality risk assessment, but it will pay off, because if Becky had known that she was at very high risk for being killed by her estranged spouse, hopefully she would have considered some safety planning, some shelter, and have gotten out of that situation whole and alive. Thank you.
Next, we'll hear from Jean Peters Baker, who is the county prosecutor from Jackson County, Missouri.
So, I'm Jean. Thanks for staying awake after lunch through a pretty riveting day in our nation's history. Riveting and sad. No matter where you fall on the spectrum of that, it's sad. I had a presentation that I was going to give, and I'm going to truncate this and start it off a little differently. And my presentation was pretty much to show you the numbers that would convince you that my beautiful, lovely Midwestern city called Kansas City, Missouri is really, really violent. We kill each other in remarkably high numbers. And we have since the 1960s. It's not a new problem, it's a stubborn problem, and it's really a tragedy. And it's one that prosecutors in my own office believe is hopeless. So I hope, if you take anything away from anything that you've seen over the last day or so, it would be that this problem is solvable. It's solvable, and it is an imperative of a prosecutor and assistant prosecutors to engage in that problem-solving nature. It's your community. It belongs to you as much as it belongs to anyone else. It is not the police's problem to fix. It is not the community's problem that they don't cooperate often enough. They won't participate in the criminal justice system. That all belongs to us. And as prosecutors, I'm really imploring you to go back home and dig into your problems collectively. Own them. And see what areas you can have a real impact in. So even in Kansas City, where we've had this horrendous homicide problem for decades, many, many decades, I do not believe it is a problem that cannot be solved. I do not believe it's a problem that has no solutions, there's nothing that a prosecutor can do to impact the bottom line. So when I come to these conferences, I always want to go home with something that I can take back home and sort of massage into the fabric of my own office and what we can do better. So I try to come up with a couple of things that I thought have worked for me, and then perhaps might be an idea for some of you. The first is something fairly simple that I started when I came into office in 2011. It's called Homicide Committee. Since I am a jurisdiction that is really weighted with homicides, I knew it had to be my top priority. It had to be something that we address and we get our hands around it and we see how we can better engage in our homicide problem. So as Mike talked about, we did launch a focused deterrence measure in Kansas City. We launched that in 2013. We are still marching through that process and working together collectively. But focused deterrence has a sustainability problem. And I don't know how to solve that. I keep looking to the academics to continue to see what new ways we can, what workarounds we have for the sustainability problem. It is something that we are experiencing in Kansas City, however, the sustainability. So, Homicide Committee, I think is something everybody in this room could potentially do in your jurisdiction, and it could be applied to any category of crime. The first thing I did was form a unit of prosecutors that would be, go to the scene of any homicide that occurs. That was really, really important to the police department that we did that. It showed them a different level of engagement than they had seen before. I thought that was odd, but they were really, they were the champions of prosecutors putting their shoes on at 2 o'clock in the morning and going to a crime scene. Prosecutors were not so excited about it, understandably. But the idea is, you go to the scene, we don't walk through the crime scene unless there's a specific reason to do so, and that we log our names on the evidence form like everyone else, and it is noted in a report why we did so. So there has to be a specific reason why you broach that primary yellow tape. But it is important that we go to the scene for a variety of reasons. The first is, you show police that you own this problem too. This is something you care about as well. It lets the victims' families know, who are so often outside the yellow tape, waiting desperately for an answer, that they see you, and that they talk to you, and they have someone that they believe is fighting for them. Police are extremely busy at homicide scenes. Prosecutors are less so. And so it gives us an opportunity to engage with a victim's family right from the beginning, the very beginning. Now there's a lot of information you can't share in that moment, but let's face it, if you've ever been to a homicide scene and family members are on the other side of the yellow tape and you can't confirm yet who's under the tarp, they know. So you don't have to tell them in that moment. You can simply tell them what you do know. You can tell them that there's a process. You can tell them that you care about them and that you're going to do everything you can to keep them informed. You can show them some humanity. And that's the first moment, to show them some humanity. My office works closely with another organization. Roz, will you raise your hand? Roz is over there in the back of the room, one of my good friends in Kansas City, who runs an organization called Mothers in Charge. And Roz is there too. And I think this is critical, that prosecutors have that kind of support system, like Rosalind Temple with Mothers in Charge, or other moms who have experienced this extreme, unplanned, tragic loss, that will stand by us at crime scenes as well, and help us sometimes walk through what the next few days ahead might look like for this family. So I think for prosecutors, it's your very first opportunity to show a community who does not trust you, that maybe they could trust you. It's your first opportunity. So when I tell assistant prosecutors who go to the scene, please don't forget that. I have to remind myself sometimes too, because you don't always pay attention to everyone who's watching you. In Kansas City, as I said, we have a lot of these crime scenes, and it's not uncommon to find yourself chuckling with a police detective about something completely different than what you're there for, but that's not uncommon. But to really watch what you say, watch how you say it, and watch your demeanor at those scenes. So the next thing we do for homicide committee is that every homicide that is solved in Kansas City, and I also had some stats to show you how few are solved. We're below the national average. And if you don't know what your solve rate is, I would tell you to go back home and know what it is, learn what it is, figure out what it is, know those numbers, because you are living them whether or not you know it or not. The community knows, especially people on the other side of that yellow tape. They know what your solve rate is. So make sure that you know your numbers, and then make sure you have a process for handling those numbers, the ones that you're successful enough to get over the line and get into a room with prosecutors to see whether or not you have adequate evidence to go forward. What had often happened in my jurisdiction, I've been a prosecutor for about 20 years, and what I experienced personally as a younger prosecutor was a team of police officers would show up unannounced at my office because they knew I was the one on call. And there was a bit of a, well, they pushed their influence sometimes real hard to get their case filed. That is not the way. That's not the way to vet and file a homicide case. If that's happening in your jurisdiction, find another way, because that's a bad process. One, it empowers a singular prosecutor's voice a bit too much, so that you can give a thumbs down or a thumbs up too quickly. Sometimes we do not have the benefit of time, and so you have to make very quick decisions based on an oral presentation of information. That's okay. That's part of what we have to do. But you always have an opportunity to go back and put that case through what we call a homicide committee, which is, a homicide committee is only senior level vetted prosecutors and police personnel that worked on that case, and we vet it together. You have to bring your jury instructions, you have to bring the prosecutor that's assigned that particular case to present it with police, have to be able to vet that case and tell the rest of the group what the recommendation is, why that recommendation is, what level of charging you want to do. We talk about how to charge it, we talk about self-defense issues, and when a case can't make it, we also talk about what other things we ask the police to do. So that the goal is a homicide case can be filed. What we have learned through this process, that some cases that were filed get dismissed, and not many, but that has happened before, that we made a quick decision during that 24-hour period of time, and it was the wrong one. Not that I can't say ever that we had the wrong guy, but we fell short of evidence. So this kind of process really does protect from that kind of environment. And it allows police and prosecutors to have a voice collectively in this whole process. It's not a singular voice, so it's not a homicide detective that gets to pressure a prosecutor one way or the other. A prosecutor can't be in a bad mood and decide, I just don't want to deal with that. We're all held accountable, and police hold us accountable, and we hold them accountable for the quality of a case and what more can be done on a case. And I gotta tell you, this is hard in a jurisdiction where we are chasing blood on the street every day. Every day, that's our reality. We don't have the staffing to do it, but we do it because it's my primary problem in Kansas City. There's one other piece that I want to talk about very briefly that we do as well, and this is a new effort that I stole from some of you already that I see in the crowd. Because so very few cases actually make it to prosecution, so very few violent crimes cases actually make it. Usually it's less than 50% make it to the prosecuting attorney's office. So what happens? What happens to the rest of that 50%? Where are they? Who's helping them? The answer is nobody. There is no advocacy group, except for Rosalind Temple in Kansas City, for homicide victims on uncharged cases. And if there's nobody in your jurisdiction, then I would say you find a Mothers in Charge and you help them form. They need it. They need your help. And they should not be left to fend for themselves. Prosecutors need to be out of their offices and in those settings so that you're telling your community, I do care about you, whether or not I can get this charge or not, whether or not that murder is ever solved, I care about your family. So on non-fatal shootings and on homicide cases that are in the uncharged status, we literally knock on their door. A group of, a team of people that includes a victim advocate from my office, but another organization in Kansas City that works with crime victims. We knock on the door, we give a bag of fresh groceries, we offer in-home counseling services, we pay for repairs to stucco that bullets have caused, or sometimes we pay for new tires when there's been a shootout of someone's car and it's their transportation to work. These are the real things that you can do that make an impact for people who are in absolute great need and they have seen very little humanity shown to them. We also do a risk assessment and a risk for retaliation. And that helps us then better understand what needs are out there. Now this program we call Caring for Crime Survivors in Kansas City, but it has a huge limitation. We do not do relocation expenses. And right now we're just sort of struggling through that. And that is, it's a huge problem. For some people it is simply not safe for them to remain in their homes. And I think prosecutors have to have an answer for that. I am trying to find a funding source for that, but this is really, really difficult. But these are some of the things that prosecutors, in ways that we can sort of remake ourselves, if we are truly advocates for victims and advocates for safer communities, well, a safe, healthy community does not allow homicide victims' families and non-fatal shooting victims to fend for themselves simply because a case could not be solved and charged. We have to find a way to be in their living rooms too, like everyone else, because that's what a safe and healthy community looks like. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean and Barbara. When I was talking with these individuals, preparing for this panel, I had a long conversation with Commissioner Green, and he talked to me about his GIVE program, which I thought was really interesting, and we decided to give a half hour for that. But then he also started talking to me about some success he's had and some things that he's doing with non-fatal shootings. And I thought that was really interesting too. So we're going to bring him back up again, and he's going to say a few words about that, and then we're going to open it up for questions.
I got it open in front. Oh, there we go. All right. I'll make this quick and get us back on schedule, but I think Jean's talk was a perfect lead into what I'm going to talk about. And non-fatal shootings have gotten a lot of attention. I think there's an article not too long ago, maybe in the Washington Post, about a major city in the U.S. looking at non-fatal shooting solve rates. And it's something we've been looking at for about 3 years now. And as we moved forward with GIVE, in particular focused deterrence, and we thought about the fact that we're up there in call-ins and custom notifications telling people that shooting is not acceptable, and that's the line, and if you cross that line, there's going to be consequences. Then we started to look at what really were those consequences, and in most departments across New York State, they're very good at solving homicide cases. In most departments, solve homicide cases anywhere from maybe 50 to 80 or 90%. When we started looking at non-fatal shootings, and there's no data out there for non-fatal shootings. You can't go on a statewide registry and see how people are doing. When we started going department to department looking, the first thing we found out is that most people had no idea how they were doing. And when you drill down and work with them to understand the data, the reality was most departments were solving non-fatal shootings at somewhere between 0 and 20%. And these are good departments. And one of the things, you'd start to talk with the detectives or the supervisors involved, and you'd say, why? And everyone can guess what the first reason is. Why? What is it? Why aren't they solving? Victims are uncooperative. So, being the type of person I am, I would ask back, well, on your homicides, how many of your victims cooperate with you? They'd all look at me. And there was a fair response to that. At least on the homicides, you weren't actively working to undercut your cases, which does happen. But the reality was that, for me at least, and for a number of us who were thinking about this, that wasn't a satisfactory answer. That didn't explain why we weren't. If we can solve homicides at an 80% rate or a 90% rate, we can do better than 0 or 5 or 10 or 15% on non-fatal shootings. And I should give credit, John Clofus, someone I've worked with for a long time, I have a tremendous amount of respect for. This was something John had been looking at for a long time as well. We had a lot of conversations about this. We started thinking about it, first of all, in the context of focused deterrence. Our message was very hollow. If we're telling people, we're telling the community we take shooting seriously, and they all know that we don't, because they know only 1 in 20 shooters gets arrested. They're looking at us like, yeah, right, you take it seriously. And don't think they don't know, because they do. And the next thing we thought of was the domestic violence. When I started as a prosecutor 32 years ago now, if a victim in a domestic violence case came to court and said, I don't want to prosecute, we put that on the record, we dismissed the case, and that was the end of it. And somewhere along the way, we started thinking to ourselves, that really isn't a good idea. We're giving a lot of power to the perpetrator to threaten the victim, have the victim come to court, drop the charge. We shouldn't be doing that. So we moved to this evidence-based prosecution model, where regardless of whether the victim said they wanted to prosecute, police investigated, they went through a checklist, they did everything they could to gather evidence. Prosecutors looked at the case and looked at whether or not they could bring a case with or without the victim, whether it was in the public's best interest to do so. We thought, why don't those same principles apply to shootings? Why are we allowing shooters to intimidate their victims and cause the victims to say, I don't want anything to do with this, I'm not going to cooperate, and the case goes away. And there's either never an arrest in the first place or it gets dropped. Police departments had categories where they were actually closing cases out as victim uncooperative. And another challenge is the caseloads. Most places we looked at, shooting non-homicides were investigated by a special unit. And they had small caseloads, and they were specially trained, and they were the best investigators, and they put a lot of resources into the cases. Non-fatal shootings went into the pile with an investigator who had larcenies and burglaries and robberies and everything else under the sun. And when they went to the hospital and the victim in the hospital room said, I don't want to prosecute, I'm going to take care of this myself, they could close that case up, get the case off their desk, move on to the next one. So we said, what if we were able to get folks to adopt a model similar to the domestic violence? What impact would that have? And we looked at the data, and we ended up settling on 2 cities for 2 reasons. Newburgh and Utica. Scott McNamara is here from Utica. He was one of our partners in this. But first of all, both of them had a manageable number of shootings. Newburgh had 40 to 50 a year. I think Utica was more in the 25 to 30 a year range, if I remember right. And we didn't want to start this as a pilot with a city that had a larger number than that or a smaller number. And secondly, we had good partners in both of those places, in the police department and the district attorney's office, and both of them wanted to be a part of it. And so the idea was, if you could get a dedicated team of investigators, and in each of those places the numbers were small enough that one team could handle all the non-fatal shootings. And I don't tell people from New York this, but I'll tell all of you, we actually funded the 2 investigators in each of the places. 1 investigator from the district attorney's office, 1 from the police department. So from the very beginning, you had that cooperation. They were called to the scene of every non-fatal shooting. They started working it from the beginning. They carried it all the way through. We funded a crime analyst to work out of the Crime Analysis Center to be paired with that team of investigators so they would have the crime analysis from the start. Provided technical assistance. For example, John Skaggs through the Justice Department came in to both Utica and Newburgh. And one of the interesting things there is that in both of those places, the presentation was to a combined group from the DA's office and the police department. And I had the pleasure of sitting in the back as a fly on the wall and kind of listening. And one of the things that I saw was there were frustrations that built up over time. Prosecutors were frustrated with things police did. Police were frustrated with things prosecutors did. And this provided a forum for people to air those frustrations. And when you've got a team that consists of someone from the DA's office, someone from the police department, really fostered the two working together from the beginning. You know, now we're hearing things like, you know, we're having discussions long before we make an arrest about, you know, collectively with the police department, the DA's office, should we go straight to grand jury? Should we do a hearing and lock the victim in? What's the best strategy in this case? How can we cooperatively work this? Within a year, the solve rates in both of those jurisdictions, which were below 20% before they started, had gone up to between 40 and 50%. And you can see the data in terms of what's happened with the shootings. I told you Newburgh in particular. Newburgh went from 55 shootings to 17 shootings to this year so far 3 shootings. From September of last year through the end of August this year, Newburgh had 4 shootings. They solved every single one of those. So, you know, will that continue? You know, I'd love to think it will, but I doubt it. But they're at 100% solve rate for the last year. I don't know, the third one they've had this year, I don't know if they've solved it or not. But the point is that if you dedicate the same resources and use the same model, there's a checklist. The police, whether the victim says, I don't want to prosecute or not, the police are going and doing multiple interviews. They're collecting the physical evidence. They're getting it tested. They're getting ballistic feedback within 48 hours to know if they're related to other cases or not. On every single case, whether the victim says from the beginning, I don't want anything to do with it or not, and the prosecutors are saying, if you bring us a case we can prove, even where the victim won't cooperate. If it's a weapons case, if it's a reckless endangerment, if I can prove the assault with the victim, we'll agree to take those cases. And as you can see in both of the jurisdictions, some pretty significant decreases in shootings so far. We do have a research partner engaged who's drilling down into each of the cases to look at qualitatively what are the differences. You know, how many interviews were done before this started versus how many interviews are done after. You know, were hospital records subpoenaed and, you know, what percentage of cases before, what percentage after. You know, so we do hope to get some really good data into, you know, what the effects are. But the bottom line is, you know, we've seen a marked difference in just probably about a year and a half now that the two jurisdictions have been at it. And the solve rates have increased significantly. And when you talk about why isn't focused deterrence sustainable, when you first go out and tell the community, we're doing something different. If you cross that line and you do a shooting, we're going to do this. They say, oh no, and it sounds great. But when 2 years later they know that you're still solving 10% of your non-fatal shootings, they say, boy, you know, I don't think we really need to take this seriously anymore. You know, so this may be one of the things that can contribute to the sustainability of some of your other efforts as well. So with that, I will wrap up and thank you.
Okay, at this point we've left a little time for questions. If anybody has any, there's microphones here and here so that everybody in the room can hear. Any questions? Comments? Concerns? Allegations? This is when the dessert's kicking in. All right, a question about focused deterrence. So we have focused deterrence model in our county, and I was going to ask the what do you mean it's difficult to sustain question. For me, I think the problem we seem to be having is keeping the community partners involved and engaged, and the victims being willing to participate. Are you all or anybody else having problems with that? Have any ideas? It puts a lot, I think, of pressure on them to come and tell their stories and be a part of the process. And so we're sort of struggling with that piece ourselves right now. Yeah, I'm not sure there was a question in there except amen, sister, me too, up on that. It's an incredibly difficult thing that we ask victims to do, especially non-fatal shooting victims, is to come forward, trust the system, we can protect you,
during the process of a case, because we cannot, we know that's true. And so that's too big a promise to make to them. So we have to try and find some other ways to keep them safe and to solve some of their problems that are keeping them from doing this monumental task that we've asked them to do. And so the only thing I know to offer in that regard would be that needs assessment. And oftentimes, from the non-fatal shooting victim's perspective, it is, I need a different location. I need to be somewhere else. And you have to find a way to solve that. We will do it on an ad hoc basis, but I do not have a pool of funds called relocation monies in which to move people. But it's a real problem, and it's one that we have to figure out how to solve.
Side dance. Mike, do you use a risk assessment instrument in your gun court?
It's actually, the way you ask the question highlights something I think is important. We're not on the front lines on any of these. So, for example, the gun court, it's Sandra on the Monroe County DA's office, the Rochester Police Department, the Probation Department. We support them in any way we can. We give them money. We try and provide technical assistance. We provide help where we can, but it's their court. And I'm not aware that they're using a risk assessment. What they do is, as I indicated, they, as a group, collectively screen each case. And the Crime Analysis Center is a big part of that process to make sure that as they do that screening, they're getting the most up-to-date information they can about who it is that they're looking at, what contacts they've had, so that they've got as much information as they can.
And so Sandra's doing that?
She's right here.
Right behind you.
So Sandra, you're doing that high-low risk assessment?
Right, it's the police department, a member of my office, and a member of probation, and they gather on a weekly basis or an as-needed basis, and they'll review the client and determine whether or not they'd be appropriate for court.
And follow-up question.
Yes.
Are you considering sending some of the folks who don't fall into the go-to-trial category, but the middle level, are you considering moving them to places outside of the neighborhoods in which they are living and where the problems that are bringing them into crime reside?
Yeah, we haven't done that yet, but it's Judge Moran. He's been a great judge for this court. He's been very creative on how he's dealing with this interim probation category of clients. So we haven't had that yet, but it could possibly happen.
And are they indicted? Are they indicted?
They're indicted.
Okay. Thanks.
Any other questions?
Hi, Ben Senator from Seattle. Barbara first, but for anybody, does your court have the authority to order the removal of firearms from a home where there's a domestic violence protection order?
Yes, we have a statute that permits the court to do that. Unfortunately, we don't have any statutory process to make that happen. So the vast majority of our domestic violence cases are misdemeanors. They are on unsupervised probation. And so the judge can order them to bring in firearms, but there's no way to follow up on the thousands and thousands of cases. And we've been working with the legislature, attempting to get a statutory mandate that would, it's a little complicated, but to get something in statute that would authorize that for them to do and hold them accountable. The felons we don't have a problem with because they are on supervised probation, and the probation officers make certain that they do a search and make certain that there are no firearms.
Dan, can you talk about what your office is doing in that regard?
Well, we have the judicial authority to remove firearms, both in civil protection orders and in a criminal no contact order. And we also have it under the extreme risk protection order, which is more for concern about suicide or homicidal thoughts in a family. But it's not; these aren't self-executing. It's just a piece of paper. And so we had to create a unit. I have a 13-person unit in my office that does nothing but every day triage and go out and give effect to these orders to remove firearms. And we're training officers about stay in the unit. You can't ask police to do it in their spare time, because it just won't get done.
Well, if no one else has a question, I have one. Those of us who've been prosecutors for a while, and I still call myself a prosecutor, I can't stop. We know that historically our role has been reactive. I mean, I would call it cleanup on aisle 3, you know. We're not there to stop something bad from happening. We come in after it's happened and we try to bring some justice to a situation. What I've seen, and these 3 are great examples of it, is kind of a transition to prosecutors being more proactive in the areas of violence prevention, as opposed to just handling violence that's already happened. And so I'd like to ask the 3 of you, what are your thoughts on that? What is it that caused you to step into that direction, which I think is the correct direction as a modern prosecutor? And also, is there anything that people here should be watching out for? Anything that's, you know, should be cause for concern when you step out into a more proactive role as a prosecutor?
So I would say first, I personally think you're exactly right, that moving from a reactive to a proactive is the way prosecutors should go. And if truly, at the end of the day, our goal is to make communities safer, that's the only way we're going to do it. You know, for me, it was prosecuting one homicide after the other, you know, and sending God knows how many people to prison for life, and the community was no safer. It wasn't, you know, that alone, it was very obvious wasn't going to do it. There had to be more. All the things we support under GIVE are proactive. You know, in terms of things to look out for, you know, I think for me it's always been and continues to be about trying to assess risk and balance competing interests. But I would say that I think there's a need under this proactive model to look at risk a little more broadly and to think a little more broadly about all of the factors that should be weighed. You know, so when I started 20 or 32 years ago, it was a very narrow view of risk, and it was, if I don't prosecute this person to the fullest extent, send them to prison, you know, is there a chance they're going to do something tomorrow and I'll get criticized for it, or my office will get criticized? And that was kind of the balance. And we weren't thinking about things like, what are the impacts of mass incarceration? And how does that negatively impact communities? And if we're over-incarcerating, you know, what's that doing to the communities we're trying to help? And am I really making people safer or not? And how do you balance that with the need to take people who are shooting and killing people and get them off the street so the community can be safe and heal? And so there's all those, you know, costs. I never thought when I was a young assistant DA about how much it costs to send somebody to prison, or how I'm using my community resources, and are we sucking all the money out of the community that we could be using for victim services and for treatment and for, you know, other services to pay for incarceration. So, you know, it's about balance, it's about trying to assess risk, but I think under this new dynamic, thinking more broadly about all the different risks and factors that go into community safety is a challenge.
For me, in my previous life, before I became a prosecutor over 40 years ago, I was a high school teacher. And one of the things that I've always sort of kept in my mind is that what I want to do is I want to prevent the generation that's coming up to prevent them from being the next generation that I prosecute as an adult. So I have focused a lot of my attention, a lot of my resources on preventing juveniles from getting into violent crime and any kind of crime. And as a result, one of the things that has happened in Pima County, when I first was elected, we had over 14,000 juvenile petitions filed every year. And we had over 450 kids in detention. working with the juvenile courts and doing some very highly specialized programs out of my office. We prosecute about 4,000 cases every year, and we only have about 20 to 25 kids in juvenile detention. They are the most violent and the most serious cases outside of those kids that are automatically transferred to adult court because they've committed a sexual assault or a homicide, and those have gone down drastically as well. I have prosecutors in the schools sharing information with the schools on who's on probation, who's on parole, and who's being prosecuted and who's a victim in their school. And that information has enabled some incredible changes to be made. So one of the things that I think is really important is for prosecutors to always be willing to take a risk, be willing to do something different, do something that is totally out of the box, because the worst case scenario is it doesn't work and you just do something different. So you change it.
The only piece I have to add to that is I think there's another arena that prosecutors, we have not done a great job stepping into yet, and that is reentry and maybe looking at prison reform. And I think a prosecutor's voice in that is really critical. I know in my state of Missouri, very little is being done within the prison system while people are doing their time to prepare them to come back out to live in my community. And so if we don't engage in some way in that discussion, we'll just kind of keep expecting the same outcome, right? That people will come out, they're ill-prepared to be out, and more crime will occur or more harm happens, either to them, to the offender, or to new victims. So I think it's just a new area for prosecutors to engage in that discussion.
I think this is a good place to stop. Please join me in thanking Jean and Mike and Barbara.